my warm greetings to you all, and in advance of International Women's Day coming up next week. Happy International Women's Day. I know that it is a very, very difficult times. I really hope that you all are well and looking after each other. Also, my thanks to Begonia for extending this invitation to me. What an amazing opportunity to share a platform with Chiara that I really appreciate the kind of a scholarship that she's producing, and then also to have an opportunity to exchange conversations and ideas with you. As was said in the introduction, my intellectual work is rooted in a lifelong activism in the context of the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And I label my activism as being radical and revolutionary, both in the process of knowledge production and praxis. So now let me unpack this claim through my frame of an analysis of Marxist feminism, which is an attempt to go beyond the notion of marriage or divorce. It's a very problematic notion, either happy or unhappy version of it. And then also culturalization of gender and reification of class. So after I do give you a little bit of that frame, I will apply this analytical frame in explaining of a dominant, pervasive theory method of intersectionality, with the hope that we can have a chance to really unpack them all together today. So let me start by the Marxist feminist framework that I use, which is the way that I try to explain it is to have a theoretical framework to speak about the social. Because I have three goals in mind. One, to explain and understand the world around us. Second, to produce transformative forms of knowledge and consciousness. And third, one, to generate revolutionary possibilities. To do this, I employ first a notion of dialectical social relations that allow me to resolve or better articulate many problems that preoccupy contemporary feminist social theorists, in particular for our conversation today, intersectionality. So to begin with, I do not view social reality or society as things, structures, or systems that exist outside of people and determines their activities or thoughts. Rather, I understand our social lives as a historically evolving form of social organization and human cooperation, by which I mean human activity and modes of consciousness. Because I understand the social world as complexes of actual human activity and associated forms of cooperation, I use the term social relations to describe the social world. Social relations are both the point of departure of inquiry for me and as well as the point of arrival into them. We cannot take ourselves out of them as we seek to understand them. Social relations are both forms of consciousness and practical, sensuous human activity. In other words, not just we think, but also what we do and how we relate to each other. These social relations are understood to exist in dialectical relationship. And dialectical conceptualization means looking at the social world as sets of relations between multiple phenomena occurring simultaneously at both local, that is particular, and global, universal level over time. In other words, I approach our social world as consisting of mutually determining relations that comprise our everyday experiences. Dialectically thinking allows us to understand experience through these dynamics webs of relations. Now, let me add another layer of analysis to this dialectical understanding of social relations, which is we have to put it in the historically specific way of analysis too. And by this, I mean that we see throughout history human beings cooperating and organizing themselves in particular arrangements in order to reproduce and produce their material existence and life. I call these forms of social organizations modes of production, which are historically specific. So I use the concept of mode of production in tandem with the concept of social relations so that we can understand the social as a form of human organization that is complex, changing, and historical, and which has developed particular modes of human relations over time. In this way, I understand capitalism, and to be more precise for our moment, capitalist imperialism, as a mode of production that encompasses social relations such as particular arrangements of race, gender, sexuality, class, and more. As historians have elaborated, and especially feminist historians, social relations of race, gender, sexuality, class, and colonialism were existed prior to the rise of capitalism, but in the emergence of capitalism, these relations became integral aspects of the expansion and consolidation of the capitalist mode of production. So let me summarize so far. My understanding of the social world is a relational one that sees human social organization as material and cultural. The social world is something we participate in and produce and reproduce through our own labor and consciousness. This analytical understanding, I argue that it is necessary because in the absence of a theory of the social, some feminist approaches have conferred upon social relations a status independent of the social whole, resulting in the fragmentation of social organization in components of gender, economy, race, religion, or even state. In other words, disarticulating what we call, that we can use different concepts for it, but disarticulating body, self, individual, agency, subjectivity, and we can also take it to a more philosophical sort of argument, ontology from the social whole, epistemology. This fragmentation does not allow us to see how the social forms exist in mutually determining relations, constituting each other constantly. And we see that separation is also happening in the analysis of, for example, feminist analysis of oppression from exploitation. So our understanding of the social, to conclude this section, must account for and explain the existence and functioning of all these relations and the differentiation historically. So one of the persistent ethical problems in Marxist theorizing is the issue of social difference. So for Marxist feminism, accounting for social differences, such as all gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, religion is the utmost importance. So a theory of difference and social relations in Marxist feminism addresses the question of why our social world is organized along the lines of all these differences. So I draw from critical anti-racist and anti-colonial feminist scholarship that examines how these differences are constructed, how they develop historically, and how their meanings circulate. However, I depart from the study of differences as cultural phenomena and focus instead on an explanation of how these differences organize social relations. So to put it differently, I try to articulate the function of difference as opposed solely its meanings or its cultural manifestation. Now, on the topic of my analysis of critique of intersectionality, I should say that intersectionality is a key feminist concept used to explicate a multiplicity of socially constructed differences. While the term itself emerged from Black feminist activism and scholarship in the 1970s, it references a problem that has been at the forefront of international feminist theorizations and struggles for decades. That is, how should we understand the organization of human life along the line of all these differences, and how should our political project respond to this reality? The concept of intersectionality, as probably you all know, has two roots within Black feminism. And it is very important for us to remind our contemporary theorists and users of this important root. The first root that is within Black feminism was work by activists and scholars to articulate the experience of Black women in the United States as being formed through multiple simultaneous forms of oppression. So in this genre, the work of Barbara Smith, Patricia Hill Collins, and the Combahee River Collective are landmark texts. The concept was then further expanded, as well as theoretically got sort of thicker by African-American feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to discuss the intersecting of race and gender with violence and poverty within the American criminal justice system. So over the last 3-4 decades, the term has gained sort of theoretical and methodological traction in critical anti-racist and feminist studies, as well as cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, geography, political science, and beyond. Though in the decades since, the concept has undergone extensive expansion, particularly in feminist studies in postmodern and post-structural traditions, and those theorizing identity and subjectivity specifically. It has been taken up as an analytical project of social difference, as a theory of oppression, as a mode of critical inquiry, as a political project aimed at radical inclusion. It is popular in academic journals and blogs, in different sort of circle of activists. Now, at this point, its usage, the usage of intersectionality has prompted several recent texts that attempt to clarify what exactly the concept means and how it has developed in order to also confront some of the historical analysis of it, as well as especially methodological implications. So today it is very common among students and scholars to claim an intersectional analysis with the conviction that it is a radical rupture with white liberal feminism and denotes a political commitment to the most oppressed members of society. I witness this claim quite often in my teaching and my political work. And in a recent solidarity gathering, for example, in support of the uprising of the dispossessed in the war-torn regions of the Middle East, here in Toronto, a motion was put forward to ensure intersectionality was observed in all the actions. So in this motion, intersectionality was seen as an act of solidarity, and it signaled representation and recognition of a range of differences within the region and also within what was happening in terms of organizing. So in this act of recognition of differences, this whole process is understood to mark and explain the historical, local, transnational, and structural conditions that have reproduced and produced war, misery, pain, and suffering for all these groups of people. So I argue that the two interconnected processes in terms of this level of recognition have limited the potential of even constrained the potential of intersectionality to go beyond representation and recognition as a mode of analysis and praxis. Now, let me tell you, why is this happening? And historically, I will argue that first, the retreat from Marxism in the 80s gradually weakened class analysis and particularly of class formation under the capitalist, imperialist, racist patriarchy. Second, and repeatedly, with the fading away of class analysis, all other forms of social differences took central stage in feminist inquiry. But we know that in actual experience of human life, as I began with this, social identities intersect all the time and all at once, not in a fragmented and episodic way that it is proposed by dominant usage of intersectionality. Therefore, if we accept that we live in a perpetual intersecting mode, then we should ask how one can form social identities can become the subject of historical, social, feminist transformation. So put it differently, what is to become of us after our gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, nationality, and more intersect? What is being socially constituted by these identity lines crisscrossing and intersecting each other? The key purpose that I have here is to articulate concisely how we approach this same theoretical and political problem from now the standpoint of Marxist feminists. While I recognize, of course, the reality that intersectionality is meant to explain, my approach is that it is impossible to disarticulate these social relations from one another without objectifying the social and artificially separating relations of oppression from each other through a cultural logic that segments race, gender, class, from capital. Again, we return to the problem of theorizing the social as something other than historically subjective human practice. For that reason, simply adding class to the matrix of identity will not help Marxists to push further into a feminist and anti-racist analysis, nor it will help non-Marxist feminists to understand material relations in a social way. So let me conclude by saying that the implication of this framework that I'm suggesting is the requirement to overcome any conceptualization of differences as separate and intersecting field of social life or identity. Rather, the challenge is to conceptualize them as relations formed within the historical specificity of a capitalist imperialist mode of production. However, even thinking of these relations as happening at the same time does not take us far enough into understanding them first as mutually constitutive, that is, being what they are through their relations to each other, and second, historically specific. To not engage in this mode of theorization also requires an overt move to reject the reification of class. Class is not another category of identity, nor form of subjectivity. Class is also a process and relation of appropriation and exploitation. It is formed through relations of oppression based in social constructions of race, gender, sexuality, culture, and other forms of differentiation. This means that a critique of intersectionality must also take us forward from thinking of intersecting forms of oppression into the dialectics of exploitation, dispossession, and oppression. This is a conceptualization that feminist, anti-racist, and anti-colonialist thinkers have a struggle to advance within Marxist circles. So let me end here, and I'm very much looking forward to have to expand all this through the conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we are just open to discussion and questions and objections and reactions in general. So please, Chiara, you want to take the word?
Should I do my presentation or just, first we have questions for Shahrzad?
The idea was if there were any questions, just to be able to share them now, and then we move forward. Yeah. Maybe you have some.
I do have a question, and I'm curious what you think of what is happening with the concept of intersectionality, in the sense that, as you rightly reminded us, it has its origin in not simply in Black feminism, like as an academic enterprise, but in Black activist feminists who use the concept to make the experience of Black women visible, right? So the main insight being that if you are, let's take the text of the Combahee Riverside Collective, if you are working class, lesbian, Black in the United States, and you are positioned in a certain intersection of multiple axes of oppression, so that their claim is, if Black women like us were to be free, all systems of oppression would have to be destroyed. So it's a radical revolutionary claim which draws its force from the fact that it comes from people who are placed in the margins. Okay, using Bell Hooks' famous metaphor, if you're placed in the margin, you perceive the center because you're excluded from the center, but you also perceive what is happening in the margins. Now, as the concept of intersectionality is appropriated by white feminists and by those who are in the center, by which I mean both the center of the world capitalist system, so, the first world, but also, and now even in my discipline, for instance, analytic philosophers placed in Yale, they use intersectionality to claim that every identity is intersectional, right? So you can see how when the concept is appropriated by people who are at the very center of the privilege, the concept just loses its critical impact. If the whole point of intersectionality is that, oh, we're all complex, we're all intersectional, so where is the radicality of the concept gone? And so my question is what to do with it? Because on one hand, there's in New York is very strong, like Black feminist, working class, lesbian, or women who are angry with the white reappropriation of feminism and the whitening away of its critical impact. And so they're arguing, we have to defend intersectionality from intersectional studies, right? We have to defend its radical impact that it had from the very beginning. I mean, it was a revolutionary program. It was to say, if we are to be free, then everybody has to be free, because our freedom would require the destroying capitalism, sexism, heterosexism, racism, and so on and so forth. I mean, maybe they're not all the axes of oppression, but there are certainly a lot of them, right? So I'm a bit hesitant, because on one hand, I think we should keep this critical potential and maybe, I don't know, speak about intersectionality as a voice from the margins. But on the other, I see also the potential of the term to articulate the way in which different forms of oppression intersect with each other. And this is for me, is also interestingly, is also a claim that anarcho-feminists have been doing, from the very beginning. From He Jin-chen to Emma Goldman, the idea that multiple forms of oppression reinforce each other has been part of the anarcho-feminist tradition for a very long time. And it's interesting that in all the literature on intersectionality, there's never a mention of the anarcho-feminist tradition, right? So the two just came out from different hotbeds, right? So Black feminist movement in the US and the anarcho-feminist movement in Latin America and Europe. So, just different contexts. But the insight is the same, right? So what do we do? Shall we just let intersectionality proliferate without worrying about losing its critical impact? Shall we be in solidarity with Black feminists who try to protect intersectionality? It's for me, it is a real question. I don't know whether you have any thought on that, Shahrzad.
For sure. I think that you're raising several questions that are at different levels. One is that I really think that the concept of intersectionality is extremely politically important. And it's not only happening in the context of Black women's struggles in North America or Europe. It is now quite common in throughout, for example, the Middle East, and organizing even for different sessions and different political platform, but also coming up with the concepts that can be inclusive. So the notion, I think the practice using of intersectionality in order to create the political platform of inclusivity is extremely important. And its awareness, its recognition of differences, especially in the context of sexuality and nationality, ethnic differences, national differences. It's very, very important. However, my sort of both theoretical and practical worry is that it remains at the level of culturalization of these differences. So it remains at the level of only theoretically, philosophically paying attention to the notion of oppression. This oppression has a social roots, and the roots are rooted, are founded in the structure of the what I call the capitalist imperialist mode of production. So this challenges the notion of inclusion. What does inclusion mean? What is to be included in if we do not look at, let's just use a structure of patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal, militarized, racist system that we want to address that to. So this is the dialectical relationship between oppression and exploitation that I think that we cannot lose sight of, and therefore understand how these relations constituting each other in order to enter into the relationship with the exploitative structure of power in the society. So what I'm proposing is that not to discard the concept of intersectionality. It is very important, and it is not possible to do it if we want to overcome this liberal feminist, bourgeois notion of feminism. What I'm saying is that let's make it, let's not lose sight of the structure of power that constitutes that margin and center sort of metaphor that you used, from bell hooks. Understanding of the nature of that center is extremely important. I mean, margin doesn't exist without that center. That center doesn't exist without that margin, but how they intersect is also very important. And the intersecting, the other problem that I see is happening is that the intersecting that we are talking about is very individualized. It's only about the ontology of being. But this, if we go back to the metaphor of a margin and center, we see that these sort of ontologies constitute the structure. The structures do not exist outside of us. That's why that in my Marxist feminist analysis, I think that understanding of the social relations and the sociality is very important, because it makes it clear that as structures, we are the structure. The structures are not things and buildings and objects beyond us. We participate, we collaborate, we create them, we produce and reproduce them. So it is that intersecting that it is also important for us to understand and have a complex understanding of intersectionality, and not sort of settled with range of differences, and make sure that our range of differences is as complete as possible. It individualizes, atomizes the complexity of social order that feminists would like to address.
Thank you.
Right. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, please. Let me
Yeah.
identify the books.
Hola.
Maybe you can speak a bit louder.
Can you hear me?
Shahrzad, can you hear that?
I can hear, yes.
There are some authors who see in syndicalism a more complete theory of justice than socialism and, of course, capitalism, in the sense that it attacks both the state and private property as the two forces of contemporary societies, two harmful forces. Of course, in theory. In practice, we all know that syndicats are not free from corruption, but my question was, what is the current state of feminism in syndicalism, and if you think that, in fact, it's like a useful tool for a more just or fair society.
Chiara, you might be able to help me with the last part of the question because there was echo. So what is the feminist?
It was in the relation between the role that trade unions might have for feminist, from a feminist approach as a contribution to this social transformation, social revolution. It was that, no, more or less? Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear such questions because it's coming from Europe. In the context of North America, there are no trade unions left. and there is a sort of a huge backlash against any kind of unionization, and especially the COVID had a huge impact on restructuring of work and unions and all of that. But in earnest, they before, especially before the COVID, there were a lot of a rethinking of bringing the issues of all related to intersectionality, not only gender, but also race specifically, and sexuality and ability within the union structure in terms of providing provisions for justice, equality, and demanding rights and privilege for workers under those conditions. It is fascinating to see that, and I know that some discussions is happening, but it is fascinating to see the impact of COVID in non-unionized working environments, which happened also to be a lot of so-called feminized working spaces, such as elementary teachers overall, but in particular elementary teachers are massively feminized sort of work, and care work, and so you can see that the way that they suffered was for those who were working in non-unionized environment, and then also losing their privileges over the last few decades of restructuring of healthcare system, employment systems, and all sort of provisions for the safety and well-being of the workers. We can see that it has created a more discussion of going back for better understanding of the unionized work environment, with taking into account all sort of justice related matters and very importantly, bringing feminist and analysis into it, and that's why that we see that the emergence of very important feminist body of knowledge on care. The notion of care, what does it mean? How does it apply? What is its function? And so all of this is very important. Thank you for the question.
Any other question? Jana, do you have a question? Also, I wanted to say that people who are participating in the session online are very much welcome to also write their questions on the chat, and then the chat will be able to read them, or we can read them also and share them with everyone. In the meantime, I have one question. Do you hear me well, Shahrzad?
I do hear you, yes, thank you.
It was very interesting for me to hear that you are paying attention specifically to differences and specifically to how they are constructed, and most of all to how they function. You said you were interested in how not so much about their ontological status, as it were, as cultural phenomena, but much more about how they relate to each other and how they constitute each other in that kind of array of differences. And in relation to that, I wanted to ask you about if you have thought about the material status of differences, as if it was possible to differentiate this status from the cultural status of differences. I'm saying that because at the same time you said that you are interested in material relations. So what could be the material approach to differences that you would agree with, that you would engage with? I am thinking of one notion regarding the status of one of those differences, class, precisely when one tries to not avoid the reification of class. To me, it's very important to consider how not to reificate other differences, such as gender difference, for instance. No? Because I understand that rejecting reification of gender or of class actually contributes to the non-reification of identity in general. And in that sense, I recently discovered a category that has been developed by Chantal Jacquet in France, a reader of Spinoza, like Chiara. That is the notion of trans class. Chantal Jacquet is developing from the perspective of political philosophy, analysis of class, that precisely avoiding the reification of the category, and in that way avoiding an ontology of reification, as it were. No? In the same way as we speak, as we can speak of transgender, for instance, no? It could be the same. So the question is, to what extent does the material dimension of relations, the material dimension of differences, then, contribute to avoiding the reification of those axes of oppression, such as class, gender, race, etc., etc. I would like you to make clear that the relation that you see between the materiality of relations and the materiality of differences. I have another question, but I'll keep it for later.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question, which takes me to sort of reminds me of mentioning something to begin with. One is that if we use, instead of intersecting of these differences, the notion of constitutive relationship, that is, when these relations enter each other, let's say gender and race, what do they constitute after intersecting that is related to the materiality that I want to talk about, which is the materiality dimension is the capitalist imperialist patriarchy. As a feminist, I would say, and I always say capitalist imperialist patriarchy, that it is also racist. So if that is the materiality in terms of the exploitative relationship, when gender and race, as an example, what do they constitute? What do they become? And within that material sort of relations, which is the entering into the relationship between oppression and exploitation. And let me also emphasize that I'm not using these concepts as one sort of in a linear or dualistic way. I'm looking at them in a dialectical way that constantly constituting each other as they are moving through social life. And therefore, and this is that's what it means by not reifying class. Class is not about things. Class is about social relations and about constituting. This class is constituting constantly itself through other forms of differences. So the class exploitation of a woman of color, of an immigrant woman today in the context of Europe, of the international students of color today crossing the border from Ukraine to Poland. These are constituting both the material social relations as well as the intersecting of a status, of identity, the color of the skin that is being implicated in this imperialist war that it is happening in the context of Europe. This is how we need to understand it. We are neither reifying class and materiality, nor reifying, that is turning them into objects, into things. We are looking at all of this as relationality, that is constituting certain social relations in the context of capitalist imperialist condition of our life. I know that your question is complex. I'm not trying to sort of simplify it, but this is how I can explain it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was very clear. So I didn't feel it was simplifying it at all. On the contrary. So, and then the other question I have is not a simple one either, probably, but it regards the affective dimension of what you are proposing. I mean, when speaking of the relevance of material relations in order to fight capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, you spoke about care just before when answering the question about trade unions, and that brings me to the same place. I mean, what role do you attribute to this affective dimension of relations, of material relations, and how can this dimension be accountable for or contribute to emancipation, societal transformation, etc.
I think that I'm glad that you asked this question, because I think it is extremely important, sort of the dimension of ethical commitment and ethical dimension of our complex relations that we are talking about. It is important ethically for us to understand the rage, the anger, and the desire, the fire for fighting back. And it is important to also build solidarity across not only these type of a complex social relations that we are talking about here, but also we are human beings with emotions, and acknowledging that emotions and that reaction is very important. Never that sort of effective way of and the weight of this nightmare of the society that and the relations that we are living in. We cannot downplay it. We cannot ignore it. This effective sort of relations, it's beyond emotions, the immediate beyond emotions on us. It constitutes also the whole discourse and the language of, for example, hope. That I found it extremely problematic in the context of, you can see it in social media right now, that all the misery of the world is presented to us, all that discussion and the conversations that it is happening. At the end, what everybody wants to hear is that, okay, we understand all these difficulties, but tell us, where is your hope? Where do you get hope? What is next? Which I really find it the most insulting thing to do, because it means that really downplaying the enormity of the struggle, the complexity of the struggle, to immediate things of the pragmatic, which is at the heart of this capitalist imperialist mode of thinking, pragmatically, what needs to be done. And I'm not arguing that looking for ways of organizing, mobilizing is not important, but I'm saying that simplifying it into the little act here and there, and turning a massive political sort of platform of actions into aids, charity work, self-help group, making ourselves feeling better, and then individualizing it is the problem, and it's not adequate. So yes, emotions and the effective impact of the world that we see around us is enormous. It is important, and it is part of another dimension, I would say, of that materiality that we are talking about. Emotions are not without really being located within this complexity, within this complex social relations that we are talking about.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, last minute question. No, I'm going to regret it there. Okay, thank you very much, Shahrzad. I think we will give the word to Professor Chiara Bottici, but let me introduce you first. And okay. Shahrzad, you remain here with us, huh? So we can keep on the conversation.
Sure.
Professor Chiara Bottici is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research, New York, and co-founder and co-director of the same institution of Gender and Sexuality Studies. Their areas of interest are modern philosophy, social and political philosophy, feminism, LGBTQI+ issues, capitalist studies, critical race theory, psychoanalysis, aesthetics, philosophy, and literature. I must say that you have in common with Professor Mojab, in a way, I believe the methodology that you're using, that it is at the border of conceptual elaboration and artistic mediation in a very also probably classical Italian intellectual tradition. No? We are very pleased to be able to read you in Spanish now. Very recently, your Manifesto Anarcho-Feminista appeared, and just a few days ago, I think it is warm still, we got your Anarcho-Feminism, also in Spanish translation, and it's going to be issued in Italian, both of them, and it was published by the end of last year in English in Bloomsbury. Also in 2022, we will have your Imaginal Politics, images beyond the imagination and beyond the imaginary. And in relation to the topic of this conference today, 2017, you published Feminism, Capitalism, and Critique, essays in honor of Nancy Fraser. Professor Bottici is currently visiting professor at the UAB, appointed by the International Master Mundus Program Eurofilosofie. We're very, very happy and thankful that we could do that. This is it. I just leave you the floor, and thank you very much for accepting being with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and also the chance of discussing with Shahrzad Mojab, whose work I've been encountered a long time ago, but we never had the chance of being in the same panel. So this is a fantastic opportunity, and thank you all for being here, both in presence and online. So I'll try to build some bridges to begin with Shahrzad presentation, focusing in particular on capitalism and its specific mode of what I would call reproduction. So with the re between parentheses, just to emphasize, as Shahrzad also does in another part of her work, that there's no production without reproduction. Now, a lot of very important work has been done by Marxist feminists around the notion of reproduction, in particular analyzing the relations of reproduction as a sexual division of labor. I do believe that there are challenges today that push us to rethink this very notion of reproduction, at least along three axes. And I will mention them, and then I will try to say how anarcho-feminism can also help us to address this challenge. So first of all, neither Marx nor not all Marxist feminists included in the notion of reproduction the reproductive capacity of plants and the more than human. Now, can we still talk about reproduction without also interrogating what is the reproductive capacity of the more than human? In order to do so, I believe we need to also question the anthropocentrism that is in a certain Marxist tradition, not in all of them, but certainly in some of them. In particular, the approach to nature through the dichotomy of society versus nature, so where nature becomes just a place for extraction of resources and labor. So questioning anthropocentrism, one. Secondly, I think it's also important to disentangle more reproduction from sex. Again, Marxist feminists have done very important work in this direction, but I think we need to do more in criticizing how the heterosexist matrix is still dominant in a lot of Marxist feminist approach that understand reproduction mainly in terms of heterosexual reproduction of babies, right? So questioning the heterosexist matrix, and I would also say the cisgender matrix in understanding reproduction, which also brings in questions of technoscience and bioengineer, as I think Michelle Murphy has been emphasizing. And third, always drawing insight from Michelle Murphy, I think it's important to understand that reproduction also takes place through biopolitical mechanism that allows certain bodies to proliferate and reproduce and denies this possibility to other bodies. So we cannot rethink the capitalist mode of reproduction today without, in my view, taking into account state politics and in particular its thanatopolitics, distribution of the chances of life across the globe, including those who are going to get bombed and killed and those who aren't, those who live in zones of death where death is a daily possibility. Now, how can anarcho-feminists, as a method, for me, anarcho-feminist is not a fully fledged program, is not a doctrine, is a method. So first, what is anarcho-feminist? Here I should say, by anarchism, I do not mean chaos or absence of order. We have other, the reason for this is simply that we have other words for it, chaos, absence of order. We can, if we want to denote chaos, we can just say chaos. We don't need anarchy for that. Anarchy for me is literally understood as absence of arche, that is absence of an overarching principle, absence of leaders, absence of formal government. So there have been plenty of examples of anarchical societies, that is, societies that lived through horizontal modes of organization, non-hierarchical modes of organization. And it's important that we keep the notion of anarchy distinct from chaos, because otherwise we don't have a term, philosophically speaking, to denote the possibility of a social order in absence of an order. And in today's world, the sovereign state is the main order of social life. And we tend to forget that for most of the history of the Homo sapiens, human beings actually lived in different types of formation that were literally anarchical. That's also the reason why there was no anarchism in antiquity, or because anarchy was largely a lived experience, right, as opposed to something that you needed to theorize. So anarchy in this sense is also different from anarchism as a political philosophy, in the sense that it denotes the possibility of an order, of a social order without an order. That this is important because each time you put the word anarchism, then it's like, oh, but so we're talking about chaos. No, we're talking about the possibility of an order without an order. Secondly, okay, feminism. Why do I put the word feminism? Can't we just talk about anarchism? No, because we tried, it didn't work. What happens if you only talk about anarchism as a philosophy that argues that you cannot fight one form of oppression without fighting all the others? What happened, historically speaking, is that gendered form of oppression and exploitation, they were just swept under the carpet. The result, just to remind us a little data, is that at the moment, there's 126 million missing girls, by which I mean the fact there's 126 million bodies that are feminized and that just went missing as a consequence of gender violence, feminicide, sex-selective abortion. So we do need feminism, but feminism is not enough because, as we have seen in liberal feminism or other types of feminism, feminism is compatible with domination. In particular, if we define feminism as simply equality with men, and if we do this, as certain liberal feminists do, by being placed in the center and not in the margins, what happens most of the time is that by equality with men, we understand the equality with white bourgeois property owner. Bell Hooks says it would never occur to a black woman, working class, to argue that feminism is equality with men, because the men they have around them is not somebody you want to be equal with, right? So when feminism is declined as equality with men, is always declined as equality with a privileged class. And then feminism simply becomes a request for being included in among the few privileged, okay? So feminism alone is not enough, anarchism alone is not enough. Here we are, anarcho-feminism, okay? What do I mean by anarcho-feminism? I mean a form of philosophy that enables us to keep together two claims. The first is that you cannot fight a form of oppression without fighting all the others at the same time. And the second is that there is, however, something specific in the oppression of women, LGBTQ plus people, two-spirit, and third genders. And I apologize for the long list, but I think it's absolutely important. That's what I do in the book in another context, to emphasize that there is not just women who are object of gender violence. That's why more than speaking about feminicide, I tend to speak about gendercide, okay? There's 69 countries worldwide where sex between consenting adults of the same sex, it's a crime, okay? So gender violence does not only target women, it also targets LGBTQ plus people, it also targets trans people in a different way from which it targets homosexuals. So we need a multiplicity of axes. And as I do most of my work, by being placed in the United States of America, which is a settler colonial state, I think is also important to recognize that how the settler colonial apparatus it also influences the way we understand womanhood, right? And one of the ways in which it does it is through what Maria Lugones called the coloniality of gender, that is the imposition of a form of gender binarism onto tradition like the Native Americans one, where gender roles were much more fluid, so much so that many Native American tribes had alternative names for gender embodiment. Today, a lot of Native American activists created these two umbrella terms, third gender and two-spirit people, to denote that their distance from the gender binarism that classifies people into men and women alone. So, okay, I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to say that what is, I think, important in this anarcho-feminist tradition is the fact that it has a vocation to question not simply the object itself, but also it has a tendency to question its own way of proceeding. Now, if anarcho-feminism means that we cannot fight the oppression of the second sexes, by which I mean women, LGBTQ+, trans people, and so on and so forth, without questioning all the other forms of oppression, this also means that we cannot provide a feminist philosophy that is truly anarcho-feminist without questioning Eurocentrism, without questioning methodological nationalism, without questioning the way in which currently in feminist philosophy there is a privileging of a very few limited philosophical tradition. I'm a philosopher, for instance, in my field. When you go and take a class in feminist philosophy, most of the people that you read actually come from maybe 3 countries. It's not even Eurocentrism, it's misleading as a category because most of the knowledge produced in feminist philosophy comes from France, Germany, UK, Canada, Italy at times, but not always, that's not always the case. Now, we cannot, and I believe it's, if we take the globe as our framework for thinking about feminism, and I do believe that in 2022, either we take the globe or we fall back into obnoxious form of ethnocentrism. If we take the globe as our framework, we also have to be aware that in the globe itself, there are those who are placed at the center and there are those who are placed at the margins. So it's absolutely necessary to do the operation because we are at the margins of Europe, but we are at the center, at the core of the capitalist world system. So the knowledge that is produced here is hegemonic in terms of what Annibal Quijano calls the Euro-Centric matrix and production of knowledge. So it's important to dismantle that matrix and also be open to voices that come from the margins. And thinking here, for instance, of Chandra Mohanty's invitation to consider those who are placed in the margins of the capitalist world in order to build a bottom-up epistemology. So in order to study structures of power and domination, not top-down from the center to the bottom, but also bottom-up, so to speak. Okay, so anarcho-feminist is therefore, by definition, also a decolonial form of philosophy, and by decolonial, I mean not simply anti-colonial, because, and I can explain more later what you mean, what I mean by saying it's not just anti-colonial, but briefly for now I can say by decolonial I mean a forms of philosophy that is constantly engaged in undoing the modes of thinking that we have inherited from a structural knowledge that tends to deny to people of color, people from the colonies, the possibility to contribute to knowledge production. This is one of the effects of colonialism and Eurocentrism, is that the voices from the margins are constantly being marginalized. Okay, and I distinguish it decolonial from again, not simply anti-imperialist, but also de-imperialist attitude, in the sense that it's important to question how imperialist mode of thinking have been internalized by simply socialization and education. Most of the education that we receive is androcentric. I always say I went to school at the age of 6. I got a PhD in philosophy at the age of 30. I've read only white men. So although you can do work to undo the damage that has been done, it's an ongoing job. There's never an end to it. And just to give you an anecdote, I was on a panel discussing Enrique Dussel, Ethics of Liberation. How many of you knows Enrique Dussel's work here? Just one. Okay, it's some of the best work on decolonial philosophy. The guy is just massive. Like, it's an incredibly important voice in the colonial philosophy. Wrote this book, 600 pages, called Ethics of Liberation. It quotes just one woman, and it's always the same, Rosa Luxemburg. I grilled him. I'm like, is this ethics of liberation, or is this ethics of liberation for men, and written by men, for men, only aimed at including Latin American men into the privilege of European men? Like, I grilled him. The day after, I was looking at the essay I wrote on Europe in a completely different story. I realized I'd quoted just one woman, me, me. So I have to, that's why I say it's important that we do, since we are socialized in this system that is androcentric and Euro-centric, that we constantly do raise this question, this doubt. Why am I quoting all of these people? Why am I, in philosophy, the constant question is, why am I only reading German, French, and English people? Why have I never read a Spanish philosopher? Has the capacity for thinking philosophically stopped at the Pyrenees? Like, is there something like an esprit philosophique that cannot go outside of France? As an Italian, I was told that Italian is not useful for philosophy because you have to. It's not a philosophical language, by which I still don't know what it exactly means, but it's a struggle even to claim that, Machiavelli was a philosopher, Galileo Galilei was a philosopher. There's always this weight of the big German and French guys, which seem to be taking the field, at least in my discipline. Okay, but so this I'm getting out of the main focus of our discussion today. But this, because I think it's really important to emphasize that for me, feminism is not enough. If feminism means just thinking about the liberation of a few privileged people in a few privileged places of the world through a few privileged philosophical framework, I'm not particularly interested. I'm interested in thinking about liberation and emancipation on a global scale, which I also think is particularly important today because the destruction of the world is indeed global. Do I have another 5-10 minutes? Mm-hmm. Now, in order to do this, I think it's also important to take distance from the sort of methodological individualism that dominates Western philosophy. So, what is methodological individualism? Is a philosophical approach that tends to think about reality in terms of the individualities within it. Okay, most of the Western philosophical tradition thinks about, even logic in terms of the relationship between the one and the many. Now, in these approaches, despite the diversity between Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza is different, but all the people you want to place in that, they tend to think individualities, okay, as the building block for thinking. Now, what I think we can gain as the best philosophical ally for an anarcho-feminist project is what in the context of the book I call a shift from individuality to trans-individuality. Using framework as different as, you can read Spinoza in that sense, but you can also use the Buddhist notion of pratitya samuppada, meaning co-origination, or you can use, I've read people who have done so, the Ubuntu philosophies for thinking about individualities as trans-individualities, okay? Now, what is the main insight about this idea of trans-individuality is that individuals do not exist. And every body is not just a process, but a process of affection and recombination that takes place at different levels. Inter-individual level, sovereign individual level, like the structures that determines what the society we live in, the world we live in, but also the infra-individual level. And that's, I think, is particularly important because this philosophy of trans-individuality emphasizes how the molecules that compose our body literally can become constitutive of what we are. So what we eat, the toxins that we accumulate on our body, or the toxins and the toxic waste that we leave in other people's countries, like they become literally constitutive of our bodies. And in this sense, they're never individuals. And think, for instance, the way in which toxic waste deposited in other countries, like in Lebanon, for instance, they become constitutive of the bodies of the people who breathe and eat and live there. So this, if we keep together all these different levels, the infra-individual level, inter-individual level, and sovereign individual level, we see how bodies come into being to what by borrowing from Paul Preciado, I call a form of somatic communism. For rethinking about political communism, I think it is absolutely important to begin with this form of somatic communism that we experience every day. Our bodies depend on not simply on the interaction with other bodies, but are co-originated and by living with other bodies, including the bodies that make up our bodies, the viruses that we enter in contact with, the structures that determines what we are, okay? Now, consequences of this shift from individuality to trans-individuality. First of all, if every individuality is a trans-individuality, then also gender transitioning is just one of the many forms of individuation. Taking hormones or individuating by accepting the gender that you were assigned at birth, they're just two different forms of becoming women, for instance, okay? So this framework allows us to have a more inclusive approach where the question as to whether trans women are women is not even raised. It doesn't even make sense. In a way, we are all trans, in the sense we are trans individual, so everybody is a process, not just trans people are processes. We all are processes. Secondly, anarcho-feminism then also becomes, by definition, ecofeminism, or even better, a form of queer ecology, because the environment in this philosophical framework is not something that is separated from us. I mean, the environment is literally us, our bodies, what we eat, the hormones we englobe all the time, okay? So, and why queer ecology? because this trans-individual philosophy also questions the sort of ontological hierarchy that we have inherited from Western metaphysics, okay? That place bodies that are endowed with consciousness at the very top of the scala naturae. So at the very top of the ladder of being, that places man literally on top of women, on top of people of color, on top of animal, on top of inanimate matter. If everybody becomes constitutive of our individuality, then all these boundaries, even the boundaries between human and animal and plants are questioned, which doesn't mean that they are eliminated, okay? So I'm not advocating for a form of queer ecology where everything is open for grab, which, by the way, would be very, very bad for queer people, alimenting the idea that, you know, we're all open for grab, just grab whatever you want. And what I'm saying is that questioning hierarchies and questioning boundaries does not mean to abolish them, okay? So we can keep distinguishing between animal and plants, but we don't put them in a situation of hierarchy because of this form of somatic communism that constantly renders the distinction and the boundaries porous, so to speak. Okay, so conclusion. Emma Goldman says that anarchism is the teacher of the unity of life. And she uses the expression, teachers of the unity of life. I use the expression somatic communism, borrowing from proper shadow, but I think the fundamentalist side is the same. It is because of this form of somatic communism that different forms of oppressions, though that we were mentioning at the beginning, are part of the same knot. So you cannot untangle sexism from capitalist exploitation and anthropocentric domination. They are like a tangled knot with different threads. And of course, in different contexts, you need to pull different threads, but always be aware, as Audre Lorde says, that they all inhabit the same house. Why the same house? Because every form of oppression is based on the idea that some people are superior to others. Sexism, the idea that men are superior to the second sexes. Racism, the idea that white people, white values, white lifestyles are superior to that of black people. Classism, the idea that bourgeois class values are superior to working class values. So all these form heterosexism, the idea that the heterosexual forms of life is superior and the norm of which homosexuals are the exception. All these forms of oppression, they have in common the idea that there are people who are superior to others and that they are entitled to dominate because of this superiority. So in this sense, as Audre Lorde says, they all inhabit the same master house. We cannot undo the master house alone, clearly, because of this complexity. That's why liberation is always a collective enterprise. But also, if we keep in mind this image of a tangled knot inside of a house, we can very well see why feminism cannot mean women in power. Feminism does not mean women capitalists, and it certainly doesn't mean just a woman president. You know, it may be nice to see one since we see so few of them, but that's not going to change the structure of power. The state is a structure whereby a minority rules over the majority of people. If you just had a woman president, you just had a woman who's going to buy into and be added into the category of the few privileged ones. Feminism does not mean the liberation of only a few privileged women. It means the liberation for all the sexes, men included. Feminism does not even mean women ruling and oppressing men. That's why I say feminism is not enough. Some people think that this is feminism. Feminism is women ruling over men. Again, we didn't have many experiences of matriarchy, so maybe nice to experience, but that's not what feminism means. Feminism means the end of sexist oppression. And I think it's important to keep in mind that patriarchy is also not good for men. Certainly, it's much worse for women and LGBTQ plus people, but it's not good for men either. You buy from the privilege, but you also live in a culture that is structured around a culture of domination. And that form of domination is gonna come back to you in one form or another. You're gonna pay the price. So in this sense, the motto, and here really I conclude, of anarcho-feminism is either all, and I really include all of us, are free, or nobody is going to be free. Thank you. Sorry if I spoke too much.
Thank you very much. I imagine that there are questions, comments. Also you, Shahrzad, if you have a question, a comment, you are welcome. Huh?
Of course, but I'll wait to hear others first.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I have maybe it's a little complex question, but my main question is how can really achieve this liberation, this emancipation in political terms if if we are starting off in an anarchy position that we don't have anarchy, we don't have a main rule, hierarchy. We are not following a revolution because every revolution implies a restoration, and maybe we are thinking in other terms. I don't know, I'm thinking, for example, Hakim Bey that proposed the concept of temporary autonomous zone, because he admits that maybe it's impossible to achieve a political society that is entirely liberated of or prejudice or capitalism. And well, my question is that how can achieve this liberation in political terms for all society?
Right. Yeah, thank you. This is the mandatory question all the time. So the anarcho-feminist philosophy that I'm trying to propose is really an impossibly demanding philosophy, because when I say either we're all free, I mean the entire planet. I mean, I really mean whole, right? Not just a few autonomous zones, which we tried. What happens when liberation is only conceived as, okay, let's try 3 autonomous zones, and then from here it will spill over through prefiguration into other spaces. In part, it can work, and I mean, to a certain extent, we've seen how prefiguration work. For instance, you know, in the Arab revolts, but then they were crushed, right? So that all these forms, all these strategies like hacking bait, they're fine. I mean, it's not that there is one recipe for anarcho-feminism. I really mean anarcho-feminism is a method, and is a method that tells us one fundamental thing. You cannot fight one form of oppression without fighting all the others. This does not mean that in specific contexts we cannot and we should not engage in specific political programs. Autonomous zones can be one of them. Syndicalism is another, much less in the US, where there are very few trade unions, but certainly in Europe, where there are still very active and present. But what anarcho-feminism adds to the already existing repertoire of strategies, existing strategies, is two things. First of all, the awareness that we still live in a world where there is a first sex and a second sex, or better, there is a first sex and there are many different second sexes. And second, it adds the awareness that all the forms of oppression mutually reinforce each other. So if you just pull one string, okay, and you say, okay, we are done with this, finally women have the right to vote, now we're going to see plenty of women in power, it doesn't work. And we've seen it. I mean, okay, great, the women have the right to vote, not everywhere, but in certain contexts they do. As this radically accomplished the feminist revolution that was expected? No. Why? Well, because, and here I have to say, for me, an important part of the anarcho-feminist philosophy is the fact that it's a form of feminism without patronym, right? So it's a form of feminism, and at least for me, that was the reason why I took distance from Marxist feminism. I mean, I was a Marxist feminist before, because I realized how much I needed other theoretical resources for thinking about feminism. For me, one of them is psychoanalysis. I do believe that we need ways, if it's not psychoanalysis, but with other ways to make sense of the way in which misogyny is internalized. Because I've never met somebody who told me, hi, I'm a misogynist. I am for the discrimination of women. And I've never met a woman who said, I'm a woman, but I'm a misogynist. But I've experienced many, many cases of internalized misogyny, even by women themselves. I've experienced many, many cases of internalized heterosexism, even in homosexuals. Now, how are we going to make sense of that? For me, for instance, adding this dimension of the unconscious is very important in thinking about possible liberations and emancipatory movement. Okay, so to respond to your question, the true answer is that there is not one single answer, and certainly it's not going to come from me. Liberation is a collective experience. So I do believe, and I don't think it is my task as a philosopher to say, here is the recipe for liberation. Go out, do this, you're going to be free. For me, that's not the kind. For me, philosophy is a discipline that can help us to raise questions and to formulate in thinking and through ideas praxis of liberation that we see happening. And I do think that a lot of the feminist movements that we see today, they are inspired, if not literally, by an anarcho-feminist lens, but they are inspired by an anarcho-feminist mode of operating and organizing. I'm thinking, for instance, of the transversal, the inclusive modes, the spontaneous modes of action, It's something that in the last 20 years we're seeing more and more in social movements, and I do think that the more inclusivity we build in collective organizing, the more chances we have of changing the society we live in.
Let me, Marina, do you mind? Because there's a question here.
Yeah, sure.
That somebody wrote, Maria Garretas, and it now that you mentioned psychoanalysis, I think it suits the conversation now. She asks, which role does desire play in trans individuality?
Right. Okay. Yes. Here. This is a very difficult question in the sense that I would have to get into the details of the philosophy of trans individuality, that my own version of the philosophy of trans individuality. So for me, desire is what I understand desire is not necessarily in anthropomorphic terms. So desire is what unites, is the kind of affectivity that unites things together.
Like the Spinoza conatus.
Like the Spinoza conatus. I mean, desire is just another name for the conatus. So is this force that keeps things together, right? But can also tear them apart according to the different context. Obviously, I haven't talked about it much here, so it's hard to respond to this question. I don't know whether the question was more general. What is the role of desire in contemporary anarcho-feminist movements, or whether it was about the trans, my own version of the trans individual philosophy. So, in my own version, desire is one and the same thing with the conatus. Sorry.
Okay, so it's going to be a bit confused because it's from some notes that I made both from Shahrzad and both from Chiara, and what I'm thinking of both presentations, we have two forms of imagining what the social movements or oppressed people, subaltern people can do to subvert a system of oppression and exploitation. And on the one hand, we have resilience or resistance, and on the other end, we have the endeavor to build something that also take into account social creativity and also destruction of the system of oppression. And for instance, on the side of resilience and resistance, I tend to individuate representation and recognition, which are definitely part also of the second endeavor, but at the same time needs to be made with other type of strategies. And when I'm thinking of intersection, on the one hand, intersectionality. On the one hand, I see the critique that Shahrzad does, and I very much understand it. At the same time, I can't imagine a strategy that lives without, and also she said it too. It's not to dismiss intersectionality, just to see the also problematic aspect of this. And that's the same feeling when I'm thinking of the anarcha part of anarcho-feminism, in the sense that if we think anarcha not as chaos, but as horizontal mode of organization, or possibility of an order without an order, the result is that we, like, in the possible strategies, we risk to end up not aiming to take power, and at the same time aiming to take, like, not how to say, like, in a loop, which is not aiming to take power, and at the same time wishing to disrupt and distract a super powerful organization, which is capitalism, but imperialist capitalism patriarchy, that is very rooted and it's very powerful. So I'm wondering, like, how do we make the anarcha part of anarcho-feminism, and at the same time intersectionality as forms of subversion, not in the individual sense, but in the trans-individual sense. Because of course that's the risk at stake, to end up in the individual resistance and resilience, which are still forms super valuable action, but don't aim to subvert the system. So that's my, I know it's very broad.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Should I respond, or Shahrzad maybe? I'll give my response, and then Shahrzad will give her response. Okay, so first thing, I do believe representation and recognition are important, but it's really important also to get rid of the idea that representation simply means multicultural add-on or narcissism of the little differences. Okay, so if for me this is interesting because in the United States in particular, the term identity politics, the first occurrence that I found is from the Combahee Riverside Collective. And when they say the most radical philosophy you can imagine comes from our identity, and so we fight for identity politics, what they meant was revolutionary politics. They meant if black, lesbian, black, working class women were free in the United States, they would mean the revolution, and that's true. Now, identity politics is used to mean, oh, each of us has a different identity, so we recognize everybody's identities without changing the economic structure, without touching capitalism. There's more to be said, I think, about the way in which this concept that come from radical militant tradition are co-opted by state institution, and then they become completely deprived of their radical. It's not even respecting its radical origins. It's just that it no longer means revolution. It just means multicultural add-on. Okay, we add one representative here, one representative there, one representative there. We invite you all to share a meal, but we still decide both the menu, what we're going to eat, and how we're going to eat, and who's going to prepare the food, right? So we need to, simply to invite different people to the dinner table, recognizing their differences. We need to change the menu, if not destroying the table altogether. So, and this, I mean, it really brings to your other question, what do we do aiming to take power while not aiming to take power? I do believe we have to aim at taking power, but also being aware that we already have power. And at least this is my spin at this side, at least a little bit of power is within each of us. Obviously, that power, because of the somatic communism, that is, in my view, the precondition for a form of political communism, has to be exercised with others. There's no, liberation cannot be an individual experience. First, because individuals do not exist, and second, because it is impossible even to achieve individual liberation without the collectivity. It's not, it's just not going to work. So, for instance, when I wrote in the manifesto that Anarcho-Feminism does not mean aiming at taking state power, simply meant saying that it must not aim at taking power structures as they are, because we've seen what happened. If you just take power structures as they are, you're just being co-opted into a minority of privileged people. So you're just going to be sharing into privilege. And capitalism is a system that is structurally organized around a minority of people accumulating capital over the vast majority of the others. Okay, so unless you change the structure, the structural system, you cannot just add a few more privileged people to the exploiters. So that would be my question. We get out of, so I understand why it may sound like, oh, we are into a loop, we have to act on all these different fronts, but that is the philosophy, you know, this is the final aim, the methodology, if you want, that would lead, at least it leads me to ask in every single context, who's been excluded from the project, right? Who's not being taken into account. But global is the oppression, global has to be the fight, but this doesn't mean that we should not act locally, because that's where we live, and that's whatever is within our reach is the place to start.
Thank you very much for both of you. I would like to ask a question to both of you. A political question, not a theoretical question. I share absolutely where have you exposed today. What do we do with the fascist backlash we are living? What do we do next week with that women? I saw a conference last week announced in the media where a woman from Vox, which is extreme right here, performed a conference announced by Feminist Is a Dictatorship. So what we do with that backlash when women just say we are a radical feminist, they are trying to fight all this kind of our oppression is all the oppression that you said. What do we do with that? Because next week we leave the streets, it's not the same experience that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It has changed a lot. So politically, how do we, what we do? How do you see it?
So why do you see this change a lot? Just to understand better your question.
Because actually it was a kind of radical feminists in the streets 5 years ago. Actually, they are right in that sense, not now. But it's not only about a backlash from the Susan Faludi brilliantly exposed that there's always the feminist and fascism. They are dancing badly in history. But we are not now concerned by this backlash. I don't know what to do. I don't know how we fight that next week with other women who are saying that feminism is a dictatorship. I have no tools
Yeah.
to confront that. Do you think if in your context it's the same? It's just
Right. Shahrzad, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you so much, Chiara. This is one of those moments that I really wish we were all together, and so that, you know, as a social scientist and an educator, would be able to sort of generate all the concepts that both myself and Chiara have used, put it on in front of us on a board, literally work them throughout. That what are we talking about? What is the differences or the points of convergence of our ideas around these conceptual notions that we have in order to explain oppression, exploitation, and the possible social transformation. So it is very difficult on the context of this Zoom and distance to do it, because I think that Chiara, coming from a philosophical discipline, is using some notions that again converges with my mode of Marxist feminist analysis, but also there are places of divergences, which is actually putting it in front of us to think it through is very, very important. And I wish that we will have another possibility of being in one room with each other in order to be able to do that. But I want to start with this last actually question, because and then sort of work my way through some of the discussions, very important discussions that we have had. You may recall on November 2019, a Chilean feminist activist came up with an anthem, a very rhythmic, very sort of soul-rising music that became sort of global, and it was performed in the parliament in Turkey. It was performed in all the cities across Europe on the celebration of International Women's Day, and many events by also activists of different sort of origins throughout the world. The reason that immediately that anthem sort of took fire, the women, you know, put fire on women's rage and anger of the situation in the world, and this is pre-pandemic, by the way, was that in that mode of rhythmic sort of engagement, they put their fingers with their actions and in words. They always said that you are responsible. What they were doing is that they were pointing out to the state that you are responsible for the violence and oppression against women. You are responsible, church, for doing that. And then to the bank, the capitalist, the institution symbolizing the capitalist system, and the military, the police, and so on and so forth. Every group of women that performed it added another layers to it. For example, in the context of the missing and murdered of Aboriginal indigenous women in Canada and North America, the settler colonialism, the whiteness of the police violence, they all became the target of this pointing to these institutions that fighting their battles over women's bodies, and that's why that it was very important, and women responded to it. Unfortunately, with the COVID, it just died down. It was an important moment because it was, after a while, women coming together and moving their bodies and individualities in the context of the violence of the structure of power and institutions that exercise retain, contain, and create all the conditions of oppression and exploitation. I always put them together for the women around the world. So in terms of the backlash that we are talking about, this backlash has started since the 70s.
Exactly.
Since the rise of the neoliberal, authoritarian, militarized, fundamentalist, if we want to talk about the context of the globe, the context of the rise of religious fascism of all sorts is very important. The traces of what we are sort of seeing right now, which is a new height of this fascist order in the world, it has started decades ago. Women have not stopped adding, talking, and bringing all sort of forms of domination into this conversation since that time, and really pushing all the theoretical, practical, political boundaries of feminism, from third world women activism and revolutionary of third worldism of feminism in the 70s and early 80s to today of women in Kurdistan, the Kurdish women, and also women that are fighting in prisons throughout the Middle East. Think about it. The largest women political prisoners in the world are in the prisons in Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, Syria. These are the women that are directly fighting the structure of power. That's why they are called political prisoners. They have committed no crimes except resisting the state power. The state power embodies that authoritarianism, fascism, capitalist imperialism, that it is entangled more than ever in the history of the world today. So when we talk about this globe, it is a very integrated globe. The idea of third world, second world, first world is really has to be dismantled because it is so integrated in terms of the levels of oppression and exploitation that we have to expand our knowledge, our sort of desire of understanding the local within the context of the global, and global how it is reproduced locally. This dialectical understanding is very, very important. Therefore, I think that, let me end by saying that I sort of inspired and took notes of a lot of conceptual framing that Chiara is doing here, but I see the tiny bit of the places of divergence. And in terms of my Marxist feminist analysis, which is not it has been criticized by a lot of other Marxist feminist analysis, because I am trying to really bring into it that notion of self. Understanding of the self is very important for me. The desire, the emotion, the affect, who is that self, and how every body of knowledge can help us to expand that self and the relation of the self and society. For example, I really think that the point, Chiara, that you made in terms of the contribution of indigenous women to the notion of the self is very important in terms of the two-spirited, third gender, and the better understanding of extractive notion of capitalism, better understanding of the meaning of land, the relationship between women's body and land, the relationship between displacement, for example. As someone that it is looking at a war in the region, in the Middle East, and the displacement of women, dispossession of women, I draw from much of the learning and the discussion of the indigenous feminist knowledge on that, which also contributes to our better understanding of the notion of decolonization. What is decolonization? How do we develop a feminist project of anti-colonial that it's becoming another important concept of our moment, because capitalist imperialism enters into the rest of the world through the recreation of a new form of colonization. They are not there. I mean, they don't stay there in terms of the institutions and running of the state. They tried it, let's say, in the context of Afghanistan, for example, but they leave. But their processes, the violent processes of colonization, remain for generations to come, unless it is uprooted, unless it is changed, not locally, globally. Afghan women locally cannot do it by themselves. They are trying. They are imprisoned, they are killed, they are flogged, they are beaten on the streets, but that cannot be done by them. It needs a larger project, a larger revolutionary feminist project to be able to do that. So let me end here, and Chiara, you can respond. Thank you. Thank you for good questions.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to just say, on one hand, I do agree with Shahrzad that backlash began. I mean, at the very moment when the feminist movement began, which, by the way, interestingly, in the context of the United States, there's always this narrative that feminism began with the suffragette movement, basically meaning when a few wealthy white women started to ask for the right to vote. It took me a few years living in the United States to realize how much colonial knowledge is deposited in that framework. Because at the moment when the suffragettes were claiming the right to vote, the Cherokee women were losing their political rights in the Cherokee women councils, right? Or they had lost it. So, for instance, from the point of view of Native American feminism, began in 1492, because it began at the moment when genocratic tradition were destroyed by the imposition of Christian patriarchy, right? So that's when feminism began in the country where I'm currently living. So there's always been backlashes against the feminist movement. What I want to say, though, is that I do believe the form of backlash and neo-fashion we are living now is particularly reactionary. And as such, it's a caricature. I mean, people like Salvini or Trump, they're not even what we call toxic masculinity. I mean, they're that too, but they're caricature of even toxic masculinity. And I think they are caricature. Women who argue feminism is dictatorship. In the US, we have women for Trump arguing, grab me by the pussy, right? Now, it's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. It is a caricature. I think it has this caricatural feature because the feminist movement is strong. So I think you should respond to those who say feminism is a dictatorship. Is the right response would be to say feminism is not a dictatorship, is actually the end of sexist oppression and even of oppression to core, plus feminism is strong. And that's why you can't accept it. That's why they say, feminism is a dictatorship, because we are in a moment where it's the driving force of the most important social movement worldwide. We see, you know, it's what is bringing people in Latin America in the streets in the millions. So yeah, I just wanted to share this thought. I do think the current neo-fascist forms they're always reactionary by definition, but these are particularly reactionary, and they are reactionary because they're aware that feminism is gaining strength. So don't get discouraged, like even more reason to take it to the street.
I know it is late.
Yeah.
But if you allow me just one question,
yes.
which I think also takes back what all the other former questions somehow pointed at, and also that refers to both of you. Because I think that I've been hearing through what you have been presenting along the afternoon, evening, that maybe the question remains for Marxist feminism, but maybe also for Anarcho-Feminism, what is left of power and what is left of power relations. I mean, I think this is unquestionable in the context of Marxist feminism, and probably at the first sight, one could say this is not a problem for Anarcho-Feminism because, as you said, the main statement of Anarcho-Feminism is to point at the possibility of a social order in absence of an orderer somehow. But I say the question remains, for me at least, does this mean also in absence of power relations?
No.
No. And then I went back to two places from which this could be elaborated, although you already gave the answer. One is, Catherine Malabou, who's been working also from that philosophical standpoint on anarchy and anarchism. She's been elaborating on one of those Darwinist principles in the theory of evolution, which is mutual aid. No? Usually people stress the fact that the weaker needs to die and the stronger adapts and adjusts and survives. And Malabou has been precisely paying attention to this other pillar of Darwinism, which is mutual aid. No? But I mean, I would say that it is as if with Malabou we are allowed to think of anarchy and anarchism as a soft conceptual framework in order to think of political relations, social relations, cultural relations. But again, the other pillar of the theory of evolution implies violence, understands violence as constitutive of those relations. The other place from which I tend to raise a question about power relations in the context of anarchy and anarchism is Spinoza himself. No, right. I mean, yes, fine, the conatus, okay, but as Deleuze later pointed out, potentia and potestas are one of the same, as it were. No? And it is precisely because of this structural tension again, which implies violence, implies blah, 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 differentiation takes place. So even from a Spinozian perspective, power, potestas, still plays a role. So, yeah, this puzzles me, no?
Yeah.
How do we integrate, what role do we give to power, etc., in the context of anarcho-feminism?
Right. Yeah, great. That's a great question. So the brief answer is no.
There is a place for it.
There is a place for it simply because you can't get rid of power. And in this framework, power is one and the same thing with the conatus. So precisely because I didn't get into details of it, but in the book, it's 300 pages for a reason. I go into the details of this trans-individual philosophy, and one of the main idea of this trans-individual philosophy is that every being, even this stone is endowed with conatus, so it has some power. So if by power we mean the capacity to do things or to prevent people from doing things, which, if I throw this at you, this is going to hit you. So it has some kind of power, okay? If by power we mean the capacity to influence a course of action, every being is endowed with power. So there's no being without power, okay? So anarcho-feminism would be an impossible philosophy, or a naive one, if it aimed at being without power. On the other hand, the places that you mentioned, first, the mutual aid. It's interesting that you mentioned this because I haven't yet read the Catherine Malabou book. I will. But in the context of the trans-individual philosophy, I recovered the notion of mutual aid through contemporary biology and the idea of symbiont. So, which has been emphasizing, like from a contemporary biology point of view, what Kropotkin had been emphasizing with the notion of mutual aid forever, for a few centuries now, when Darwin was emphasizing all the aspect, and not so much Darwin as Darwinism, we're emphasizing how much competition and struggle is part of life. Kropotkin was pointing to the notion of mutual aid as with an important observation that we perceive competition and not mutual aid because we're imbued with capitalist ideology, which I think is still the case. Each time I teach this stuff to particularly US students, they always have the question, how are people going to help each other instead of competing against each other? And you always have to respond by pointing to the fact that mutual aid is not simply, oh, I help you because you're nice. What I mean, that's why I speak about somatic communism. What I mean is that there's no life which is not life in common. Even individuals are not individuals, are symbiont. A cow is the result of all the individuals that coagulate through desire into this body, which is a cow, which includes all the microbes, all the individual bodies that compose this macro body that is an individual cow, right? So in this sense, there is always power, and I would think about mutual aid indeed as a form of power. And secondly, I'm not sure whether potentia potestas are the same thing. If they are for Spinoza, but who cares? For Spinoza is also sexist. We don't need to just side with him, right? Forget about Spinoza. And indeed, the same philosophy of trans-individuality, you find it in the Buddhist notion of pratitya samutpada, Ubuntu philosophy. When I presented anarcho-feminism in Mexico, a lot of people there told me, oh, what you said sounds a lot like Aztec philosophy. I have no knowledge about that, but I'm like, yeah, why not, So I'm not wedded to Spinoza. There's no, for me, there's no orthodoxy or to defend it there. So I would say, and I would even go further though and say that by power, I do not simply mean the conatus. I mean, I think that in anarcho-feminism, there's also place for using existing structures of protestas for change. And I see it all the time. Like, I am in an institution where I do occupy a place of power, not just in terms of potentia, but also protestas. And if I don't build an institute called Gender and Sexuality Studies Institute, which is an act of protestas, because I have an institutional role, I don't like it, but I do have it, there would be not a space for LGBTQ plus people and women and people who are doing feminist philosophy to come together inside that institution. Is that incompatible with anarcho-feminism? No. Why should it be? So I do think that power is important. We have to be aware that when we think about power, since we are so imbued with state ideology, we tend to think that power is state power. And they are one and the same thing. I think that's one of the forms of power, but it's not the only one. I do see a danger in believing that just by adding a couple of women to the government, this is going to change things. Margaret Thatcher didn't do any good for women, right? Let's say it. Just adding a woman there doesn't do any good. You need to change the structures.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricky. Shahrzad, do you want to add something to this discussion about power?
I will be very brief. In terms of the point that Chiara is making on trans individuality and an individual, that role, that core. And I agree definitely that there is power. I mean, everything is imbued with power. But let me just, as a social scientist and as educator, to bring this example and share it with you. Next time that you have your breakfast, think about everything that you put together in order to have your breakfast. Your tea, coffee, bread, cheese, butter, simple cereals. And try to find the individuals within each product that it is at your table, to see who put it together, under what conditions they were put together, and how it was brought to your store, and then the way you picked it up and you brought it to your table. These are not items. These are not items for consumption only. It has been told to us and sold to us on the basis, the ideas of these are things, objects, detached, fragmented from the bodies that are embedded in them. And therefore we enter into that relationship in that matter. That is, everything around us are things. The chairs that you're sitting there probably are built in Bangladesh or Ethiopia or Vietnam. You are sitting on the labor of the people. And by doing that, you are entering into a relationship. So think about it in that way, that how we are connected even through items that appear to us as object lifeless things. These are not things. And if we think about our world and the way that we are relating to that world in these channels of connecting and connectivity and constituting constantly relations, then we have a better way of understanding both power and also how to change it. If our dream and desire is that to change this relationship, it means that we have to forge different forms of our relationship in order to be able to do that. This is very important. This is how I think about the world constantly, and understanding it in this very human way. Us with each other, and us with the nature, and us with everything around us. And therefore, understanding it within that way, it brings us to the question of power, change, transformation with self, society, and so on and so forth. We can start the whole lecture all over again. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Shahrzad. I think that you took upon again this affective dimension of material relations that sometimes capitalism not only erases, but maybe even worse, perverts. So very, very relevant what you just said. So I find it being very grateful to have that as closing words, closing remarks.
Yes.
Very inspiring, and yes, from very afar, very, very close. So I would like to thank you all very much, those who came here and attended this, participated, also those who attended and participated online, and especially you, Shahrzad, and you, Chiara, for sharing your work with us today and celebrating the 8th of March. So thank you.
Thank you.